And I'm Ben Swan filling in for Steve Malzberg. Welcome back. Well, some say that the GOP has an identity crisis right now and that one of their big issues is reaching out to minorities and to women. So could a libertarian-leaning leader like Senator Rand Paul help bridge that gap? Joining me now is Jack Hunter. He is a contributing editor of Rare.us and a former aide to Senator Rand Paul. Jack, thanks for being on.
Good to be with you.
Let's talk a little bit about bridging this gap. You know, Ferguson is a great example. Senator Paul was actually the first real national leader to stand up and to call for the demilitarization of police in light of what was happening there in Ferguson. But he has a very strong record in terms of really standing up for these communities that really in the past Republicans, at least in appearance, don't have a strong record on, correct?
That's exactly right. So, and I wrote a piece for this for Politico magazine or on the subject. Conservative Republicans typically, when it comes to these sort of law and order issues and where it's sort of racially explosive, involves minorities, African Americans often. We saw this with Rodney King in the 1990s. You saw conservatives generally take the side of the LAPD, who are obviously doing really horrible things to Rodney King. We saw this with Trayvon Martin and George Zimmerman, where conservatives would sort of rush to make a hero out of the gunman Zimmerman and to make a villain out of Trayvon Martin. Now, some of these situations are complex. In Ferguson, you saw, a lot of the same thing, where some conservative Republicans did not want to give African Americans the benefit of the doubt. Michael Brown was still learning the details, but were very hesitant to give the benefit of the doubt to the African Americans who were victimized or whatever happened, and were more than willing to wait and hear what the police had to say. What we see now, a difference coming from conservative Republicans, particularly Senator Rand Paul, is a sort of libertarian approach where they're saying, no, actually the local police have weapons and are doing things that are more suited to a small army battalion than officer friendly, the local neighborhood police, if you will. This is an over-militarization, a militarization period of law enforcement that doesn't need to be happening, and the African American community there, no matter what we learn about Michael Brown or anything else, is right to perceive that they're being targeted based on their experience with the police, their perception of the police being this sort of militarized force. I think we're seeing a very different dynamic or narrative as far as the Republican Party goes, and libertarian Republicans like Rand Paul have a lot to do with that.
He absolutely does. Another thing that Senator Paul has done recently is he's taken on this federal prison reform, where he's really working to change, along with Senator Cory Booker, some of the federal requirements in terms of prison sentences.
Have a justice system in this country under the mandatory minimum laws, which Rand Paul and Cory Booker and others are trying to get rid of, Mike Lee and some others, that, somebody could make a mistake in their youth when they're 17, 18, 19 years old, get caught with a marijuana cigarette or whatever else they're doing, and, do some serious time over that and have a record that will follow them the rest of their lives. Senator Paul spearheaded efforts to restore the voting rights of ex-felons, to allow them to have guns again, 3 decades after they did their time. These are things, and, you made the point that it's not racially, it's not intended to be racial, but it is racial in the sense that it is minorities who bear the brunt of these horrible policies. It is up to conservatives, if they're genuine constitutionalists, if they believe in limited government, to go beyond thinking of big government as just, high taxes, too much regulation. Actually, big government oppresses a lot of different people in this very diverse country of ours in many different ways. If conservatives are going to do outreach, they're going to have to impress upon people, especially minorities, how big government is harming them and hurting their lives. I think what's happening in Ferguson and how Rand Paul chose to address that is an example of that. I think restoring ex-felons voting rights is an example of that. I think there's many different things that conservatives can do that they haven't been willing to do and are only now willing to do because you have libertarian Republicans with a little bit different philosophy pushing these things. I think it's refreshing. I think it's good for the Republican Party. I think it's good for the country. I think it's good for minorities.
You mentioned the restoring of voting rights for felons, and those are obviously non-violent, I believe. And you, again, correct me if I'm wrong, but non-violent felons that he's pushing for that. And essentially, we're talking about people here who, again, have been caught with a marijuana cigarette at some point. They had a joint with them, and they get arrested, and it's considered a felony because they had, marijuana with them. One of the major issues that we see taking place when we have this discussion right now, though, it does come down to the rights of the individual over the collective. And I think that in a lot of these communities, especially what we're seeing in Ferguson, the real battle there wasn't over the fact that it was just Michael Brown. It is revealing a lack of confidence that people within those minority communities have in government, and a distrust they have for police officers and for law enforcement. And I think as the libertarian streak in the Republican Party continues to grow, it stands up for those people and says there's good reason at times that you all don't trust government or you don't trust law enforcement because they're not trustworthy on occasion. Is that correct?
That's exactly right. And look, the worst thing we can do as human beings, forget about conservative, liberal, libertarian, if you will, is to dehumanize people or to dismiss their concerns or their grievances as a group. For example, many of my conservative friends and my criticisms of militarization of law enforcement are saying, well, why are you, acting like all cops are bad? I'm not acting like all cops are bad. I think most cops are good people and well-intentioned, but I think they're stuck in a system, the militarization of police, which comes from federal incentives and turns them into small armies, that creates a bad situation. And that's true on the opposite side. African Americans have a legitimate beef, a legitimate grievance that they are being targeted and treated differently from people of other races and different socioeconomic classes because of the color of their skin. The Michael Brown reaction, no matter what we learn, whether the officer was in the right, whether Michael Brown was in the right, or what we learn about that perception that led to those protests, that is a legitimate grievance that conservative Republicans have been reluctant to look at. Now that we have libertarian Republicans, and not just Rand Paul, Justin Amash is good on this issue, Thomas Massey, many others. Now that we have them sort of in leadership positions, I think they're opening conservatives' eyes. Look, the African-American side of these racial conflicts, these things that happen from time to time, is not only worth listening to, which conservatives usually don't do, but they also have a point, and here's why. I think to the extent that you can explain that to fellow conservatives in language that they understand and sort of open their mind and open their eyes, I think it's wonderful for everybody involved. I think it's the right thing to do.
Well, what we've also seen, as you know, Jack, throughout the country is an issue of police tactics becoming increasingly militarized. We also see over and over that so many things that happen, we almost have within the context of media this belief that anything that happens to someone who is quote unquote committing a crime. So if the person is caught, with drugs, well, that makes them a drug dealer. It doesn't. It doesn't necessarily. We have these archetypes that we've already formed around people, and we view them as being guilty until proven innocent. And unfortunately, because of that, many times I think what we start to see, as you pointed out, a dehumanizing of people.
Right.
What Senator Paul, and you mentioned Justin Amash right now. Justin Amash, I think, is a great example of someone who in Congress just won a very, very difficult primary. I mean, really got out of a situation where establishment was coming after him with incredible amounts of money and smearing him because he's a guy who simply stands up for rule of law and the rights of the individual.
I think that's accurate, and that race got pretty nasty. And you saw the old Republican establishment, that sort of old mentality, going after Amash with everything they had. I mean, let's not forget Amash, who's of Arab American descent. His Republican opponents in that primary said that he was Al-Qaeda's best friend in Congress. So you read into that race baiting or ethnicity baiting what you will, but it got nasty. And that's where a lot of conservatives are at. Look, we need to move beyond this. You talk about racial disparities in the legal system and whatnot. There are plenty of white professionals out there who have prescription drugs that are every bit as potent, or if not more potent, than some of the things that young African Americans, Hispanics, and others get arrested for. But that's legal. That's okay. We look the other way on that, or we don't even need to look the other way. It's legal. It's fine. But poor people who make a mistake with something like marijuana or other drugs are thrown in jail for 3 decades for doing things that, these hypocritical, people in other situations are also doing. We need to be able to open our eyes and to see the contradictions in our culture, the hypocrisy on all sides. And, just because somebody breaks the law doesn't mean we should dismiss them forever, especially when those laws are pretty stupid to begin with and don't make sense. The law is not always correct. We need to address some of these laws, change some of these laws, reform some of these laws. Rand Paul's doing that. Amash is doing that. I do think, with the 80 million millennials who are going to be the biggest group in this country, if you will, age group eventually in voting, I think you see a fresh, younger perspective in the rising generation that's really going to change a lot of these things as well. I have a lot of hope for that.
I think that's absolutely true. And I like to say, Jack, many times that not every law is lawful, and it's important for people to remember that.
Right.
Thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate your time this afternoon.
Good to be with you. Take care.
Thanks. Well, up next, the very best of Give Me 5 when the Steve Malzberg Show comes back right here on Newsmax TV.